On November 25th, 2015, police would be called to the residence of Heather Jones. Heather had called, stating her husband was attempting to shoot her. Once inside the unkempt house, officers would find pornography, dead rodents, and firearms, all littered throughout the house. Among this were the remains of a child. Little did the officers know, they would soon uncover one of the most horrific cases of child abuse ever discovered. In order to explore this story, we need to head back to May 15th of 2008. On this day, Adrian Jones would be born to his mother, Diana Pierce, and his father, Michael Jones. Adrian would primarily live with his mother for the first 2 years of his life. However, he would eventually be found to be home alone, with Diana nowhere in sight. And with this, social services would remove him from the home and place him in the care of his father, Michael. By this time, Michael had already remarried a woman by the name of Heather. In just a few short months, Adrian would be cut off from his extended family members. Along with this, Adrian, as well as his 6 other siblings, were homeschooled. Unfortunately, this meant that Adrian was completely shut off from the outside world. Because of this, Michael and Heather would be able to get away with their horrific abuse of Adrian. Within a few months, Adrian would go from being healthy and happy to malnourished and battered. His eyes had become sunken in due to the weight loss. With Michael and Heather already having 6 other kids in the home, there was little room for Adrian to adjust. In December of 2011, social services would receive a call that one of the kids in the home had lost a staggering 23 pounds. Once the social workers went to investigate, they would find Heather high on drugs. Along with this, they would discover firearms all over the house in reach of the children. In that same month, social workers would receive a second call that one of the children was suffering from internal bleeding. Michael and Heather would claim that he had fallen down the stairs. Later on, a doctor would state that the injuries could not have occurred from this. Adrian's siblings would report to the social workers of the ongoing physical abuse within the home. They would state that on one occasion, Heather took Adrian into the bathroom and closed the door. After that, the siblings could hear the sounds of Heather strangling Adrian. The kids would also complain of their father's violent temper. Official documents state, father hits the children on the head, father puts the children in a corner and hits the legs, stomach, and hands. Father's hands were red after he hit the children. Despite all of this, the social worker would have Michael sign a document promising to keep the children safe from physical abuse and not use physical discipline. The children, minus Adrian, would be taken out of the home and placed with a relative. Only a few months later, the kids would be placed back into the home. Social services would soon receive another call that the kids were being spanked until they bled. Social workers would once again investigate the home. Michael would admit that Adrian was stealing, lighting fires, wetting his bed, hoarding food, and picking at sores on his body. All of these are trauma responses that occur in children who are victims of abuse. On March 4th, 2013, another call would report that Adrian was forced to stand in a corner for over an hour and forgotten about by his father and stepmother. Along with this, dead animals would be found to be all over the garage. The house was also described to be filthy with mice and chicken bones. A day later, the social worker would find that Adrian was being locked in his bedroom for hours. The investigation would also find that neither he nor any of the other children were receiving an education at this point in time. Despite all these horrific discoveries, social workers would close the case on April 8, 2013. The abuse would only escalate from here. On July 8, 2013, yet another call would be made to social services. According to official documents, the caller would state that Heather had been beating the living daylights out of the children for no reason. Along with this, it was reported that Heather and Michael had been selling crystal meth out of their home and that the children had been locked away in a room. An interview of Adrian would be conducted on July 17, 2013. It was here that Adrian would state that his father and stepmother yell at him. Even more horrifying, he would state that his father had been kicking him in his head and punching him in his stomach. Adrian would go on to say that his stepmother would pull on his ears and throw him on the floor and that it hurts. This investigation would conclude that Adrian was a victim of neglect and abuse. They would further determine that Adrian had severe mental health problems, most likely stemming from the trauma throughout his lifetime. Despite the department determining that he was not safe in the home, he would still not be removed. Instead, they would provide in-home services to prevent the neglect and abuse from continuing. They also concluded that Adrian was in desperate need of medications and counseling. Heather and Michael would state that they did not feel the need for either of those, nor would they meet with any more social workers as they were moving to Kansas. And with this, the case would be closed. On August 21st, 2013, an 8th call would be made to social services. The caller would report that Adrian was still being locked in his room and that he was being targeted by Heather. This call would launch a Level 1 investigation, the highest level for the child abuse hotline, which requires a 3-hour response. On that same day, social workers would go to their home, which was still in Missouri. Upon arriving, Heather would state that she did not want them to enter the house. Social workers would document Adrian's declining mental health, as well as the guns which were still in the home, and the fact that he was still being locked in his bedroom. Even with these documentations, a case would not be opened. Inside the house, Adrian would be treated as if he were less than his siblings. While only getting to eat plain oatmeal, his brothers and sisters would be gifted with McDonald's and other fast food. Another Level 1 investigation would be issued on February 25th, 2014. And with this, a social worker would contact Michael that same day. Michael would admit that Adrian had been eating everything in sight and that he would isolate him from the rest of the family by locking him in his room. Michael would also tell the social worker that he thought it would be best for Adrian to be in state custody as he did not want him in the home. Despite all of this, Adrian would still be allowed by social workers to remain in the abusive household. Only a few days later, social workers would arrive to the home to find Adrian with bruises on his face. They would also learn that the 7-year-old was being forced to do jumping jacks and push-ups for hours upon hours. Adrian would also show marks on his body where his father had taped his arms and legs together as a punishment. Despite children around this age still developing their concept of time, the social worker would write the marks off as appearing older than Adrian's description of events. Around March of 2014, Adrian would be removed from the home and placed in a treatment facility where he would be evaluated and found to have experienced extreme neglect, abuse, and trauma. He would also be diagnosed with PTSD. During his stay here, Adrian's mother and father would not contact him for months. This would go on all the way until he was released on September 4th, 2014. Exactly 1 month later, Heather would email Adrian's therapist. In her own words, she would state that he was back to the same stuff he was doing that got him put in the facility. Most likely, being put back in the same abusive environment triggered Adrian's PTSD, which led him to release the stress in the only way he knew how. Along with this, his father and stepmother had again failed to enroll him in school. Unfortunately, from here on out, the abuse would escalate to pure torture. On a regular basis, Adrian would be strapped to a table, blindfolded, and his face cracked open with a broomstick. If it wasn't the broomstick, his father and stepmother would tase him, leaving horrible marks on his body. Even for grown adults, tasing should not last over 15 seconds. With Adrian, they would do this for up to 20 seconds. Eventually, Heather would give her landlord her iPhone, asking if she could download pictures of her children. The landlord, named Jen, would agree but make a horrific discovery. There on the phone were pictures and videos documenting the torture of Adrian. Sadly, the pictures would document Adrian's transformation from a happy, healthy child to a broken and malnourished one. According to sources, Michael and Heather had set up a surveillance system simply to monitor Adrian's every move. In one of these videos, Adrian could be seen with his hands and feet handcuffed while being forced to stay outside in the freezing cold month of January. In another video, he would use his mouth to pick up a bowl on the ground and eat the contents inside. Despite Adrian doing this out of starvation, Heather would walk back inside, telling her children about how he had just eaten a bowl of applesauce filled with bugs and dirt.
That's applesauce. Nasty applesauce. The kids put dirt in.
And bugs.
And bugs.
That's just nasty.
In other instances, Adrian would be bound up to the point where he couldn't move a muscle. A bar of soap would then be placed in his mouth. After this, they would place a plate of food in front of him, knowing he couldn't eat from it. Even when he was not bound up, alarms had been placed around the house. If Adrian were to get any amount of food, they would sound, and Michael and/or Heather would stop him from eating. The only things Adrian would be allowed to eat was old food infested with maggots and fly eggs.
Why are you doing that?
Because I keep on getting cold when I'm out here.
So you eat out of the trash because you keep on getting cold because you're outside?
At nighttime, his father and stepmother would force him to stand neck deep in their dirty, freezing cold swimming pool for hours. As you can see from the picture, he is extremely malnourished at this point. Sometime around here, they would strip him of his very name, simply referring to him as the boy. More of their surveillance videos would show Adrian having to sneak basic necessities such as water. During the daytime, they would put him in a straitjacket before locking him in a shower stall. Michael and Heather had turned this filthy shower stall into a makeshift cell. Unfortunately, this would be his final resting place. In the days leading up to his death, Adrian would become so weak that he could no longer hold up his own body. His siblings would later report that they could hear Adrian screaming that he was going to die. In response to this, Heather would tell him to suck it up. Sometime around this point, Adrian would die alone, strapped to a chair in the dark. Even after discovering that he had died, Michael and Heather would leave his body in the shower stall for over 2 weeks. After this, they would purchase pigs, starve them, and then feed them his body. In the pig pen is where he would later be found after Heather called the police for domestic violence. Both Michael and Heather would be sentenced to life in prison. During trial, the prosecutor would state that Adrian's death was one of the most heinous crimes they'd ever seen in their 27 years in that field. Despite partaking in the abuse and psychological trauma, Heather would play victim by stating, "I can't go back now, but I truly, from the bottom of my heart, am sorry I wasn't strong enough to protect him." Later on, it would be ruled in court that the social workers would not be held accountable for their inactions.